And the first speaker, actually, it will be another paper or presentation of two delivers, and the first one will be Professor Yona Sapo. I hope I said it, Pepe Lazis. It's okay, Pepe Lazis. And now I understand why you ask about the music, the last professor, because I see that you are in the National School of Dance. So you are very close to these kind of things. But anyhow, this is, and then she will be followed by Dimitrios Varvaritis, and you told me that you want to cut it short, but really take your time and explain us, because it's going to be a very interesting presentation. Please. So, Paradise, you are right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, come over here. You know how to use the arrow to go.
Okay. Well, I'd like, first of all, to thank the organizers for inviting me, Professor Kazamias, and in particular, everybody, but also Dr. Mathopoulou, who is actually a co-author of mine in another paper. And I would like to say a few things about the project I run, since we have time. I am writing the history of the Greek corporate sector. And it's the first time that in Greece that we have collected all the company charters from 1830, the date of liberation of independence of Greece, up to 1929. And it started off as a lone project with a few students, but now the number of collaborators has grown over the years, and co-authors. And I use this study of the corporate sector to look at Greek society and economy in general. It's sort of like a window to understanding better what modern Greece is about. Now, this paper is connected to this project, and I'd like to say that also I have written about Jews in the past, but not Jewish businessmen and bankers, but I wasn't focusing on them. And what I'd like to say is that this paper we are presenting is already published, and that we have dedicated this paper to David Landis, and that this paper is only part of the story. Hambros Bank, you may have heard of Hambros Bank, a very large merchant bank in London, virtually monopolized the foreign loans of the Greek state during the interwar years. It arrived in Greece as the banker of the king. And also, there were other Jewish bankers involved with financing Greece. Of course, the first independence loan was raised by Rothschilds. So the the international financial presence of Jews is not covered in this paper, but it's there. I'd also like to say that Greeks and Jews, we have one common element. And this common element is that we are diaspora nations. The Greek diaspora and the Jewish diaspora individuals collaborated, and Dimitris will talk about that a bit more. And what I'd like to say is that, to my embarrassment, in Greece, in Greek economic history, we have not considered the Jewish population of Greece as one of us. I say this with droppé. I'm embarrassed, but this is the truth. About 10 years ago, I asked from a graduate MSc student to do a project on foreign investors in the Greek corporate sector for 1 decade. And surprisingly, when he brought me the list of foreign investors, among the Italians and the Germans were Jews who lived in Greece. And this showed me very clearly how we see the Jews. We see them as the other, not as us. And this has to be corrected today. So let us hope that work like ours will help put the Jewish factor into Greek business history. Now, there is a bibliography on Jewish presence in business, but it's very narrow, and most of it focuses on Salonika. And of course, with all respect, prominent people like Molho, Dritsas, and others, Dimitri, we have put this down in the paper, Orly Meron, yes, with her monograph, have really added to our knowledge, but these are very focused on one city. So what we did is we took the charters of the founding companies. You can see here a sample of a charter. They're all published in the Greek Government Gazette. And it was a painstaking process. We had to look at all the company charters from 1830 to 1929. This part of the project was undertaken by Dimitrios, who could recognize Jewish names, because many of the names are not recognizable by me, because I'm not a Jewish scholar. And we had to detect which companies had a Jewish presence. And what we meant by a Jewish presence was that at least there was one Jew either on the board of directors or among the shareholders. So the number of companies that we found that had a Jewish presence here I'd like to say that we separate the presentation in two parts. The first part, we look at the demographics of joint stock companies with a Jewish presence, and in the other part, part 4, we look at we chart the features of Jewish shareholders. Okay, now total population of companies. So we have a total of 54 companies that had a known Jewish presence. This amounted to about 5% only of the total population of joint stock company startups. This is 5% sounds small, but the number of Jews in Greece as a percentage of the population, at least until 1913, was extremely small. It was under 1%. And if I remember well, in the Greek national statistics, we tried to look up to see if they had Jews as a percentage. And I remember not being able to see anything. So I will refer to this again, why the 5% has some impact, even though it looks small. Now, the second thing we look at is at the geography, the total number of locations where the Jewish presence companies are found are 10. The total number of location for joint stock company startups in Greece between 1830 and 1929 is around 500 something. Is around 50. And so 10 is not a small number. I mean, that the fact that we find Jews in 10 locations out of the 50 means something. And what is very interesting is that the most important location was Athens, with 18 startups, 18 new companies, and Salonika with 13 new companies. In the 1920s, Salonika was the base for 1 out of 4 of Jewish presence joint stock companies established during the decade in the country. Now that I've spoken about geography, if we think that this 5% concerns only 10 locations, and especially 2 locations, Athens and Salonika, we can say that the presence of the Jewish business community was quite large in these 2 cities. Whereas at the national level, it doesn't look very large. If we take these 2 cities separately, we see that it's not 5%, but in these 2 cities, it's much larger. And as I showed in the case of Salonika in the 1920s, which is the decade with the largest number of Jewish presence joint stock companies, we find that Jews were quite present in the nascent, in the young corporate sector of Greece. Sectors. Surprisingly, the sector with the largest number of Jewish presence joint stock companies was industry. Usually, we find Jews in merchant activities, in finance, and what is interesting here is that we find them in another sector, which is industry. How can we explain this? We can explain this because most of the Jewish presence companies were founded in the 1920s, and most of joint stock company startups were in the 1920s. And the 1920s was the decade where, I hate to say this, the Professor Apostolidis, but Greek industry really started to experience its first intensive phase of expansion. So what we see here is that the Jews really participate in the Greek nascent, again, industrialization. So they're part of the new thing that's happening in Greece. They're very avant-garde, let me put it this way. And this is really lovely to see. And also industry is a specifically difficult sector, because in industry you have to put capital, lots of fixed capital. And the fact that Jewish businessmen went into industry and put capital means that they had a trust, they had a sense of feeling at home, of belonging. And I think this says something about how in the 1920s the Jewish community is really integrated into Greece, and I'll say more of this on the company size. Now, the other thing we look at is company size. The joint stock companies with a Jewish presence varied in size from very small startups, you understand what I mean by startups, new companies, to very large companies. And here we have made 5 categories. Totally Jewish-owned firms, family firms. B, where Jews had large stakes in firms in which there were also Greek shareholders. C, minority stakes in firms in which most of the shareholders were Greeks. D, minority or majority stakes in firms held by Jews living outside Greece. Initially, most of Jewish involvement in the corporate sector came from Jews outside Greece. And then E, no Jewish shareholders but Jews on the board of directors. What is interesting is that around half of the firms in which there was a Jewish presence belonged to category C. Next in importance were categories A and B. Now let me go back to remind you what C is. Oh, πώς πάω πίσω? Αυτό. What does this show us? That they were minority shareholders in firms in which most of the shareholders were Greek. This shows, again, integration. And I think that's very interesting. Now, category A became very important towards the end of the period, in the 1920s, which also shows the step forward of Jews that they felt confident enough to set up joint stock companies on their own. Okay, I think maybe at the end, I'll have, during the questions and answers session, I will have something more to say. And now I'd like to introduce Dimitrios Varvaritis, my co-author, a young uprising scholar in Jewish studies, and it has been a great pleasure to collaborate with him. We've also written a paper, which is published, one moment, Dimitri, on foreign capital in Greece. And what we find, there is a similarity between the Jewish pattern and the up to 1920 and the foreign investment pattern, is that most foreign investment in Greece was usually in firms where there were also a lot of Greek shareholders. And I just wanted to mention that. Okay, thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Professor Pepelassios for her kind words. It's much too kind, and I need such... Anyhow, second point, I would like to thank, on my part, the organizers, Dr. Marthopoulou, Professors Kazamias and Benartsi, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see Cyprus for the first time. As Professor Papalassis said earlier, I will look at the aspect of our paper which covers the Jewish shareholders. And one other exclaimer, as my family has told me many times, I kind of live in the Stone Age, and so if I make mistakes with technology, please show some forbearance. I do my best, but my mother said I was special when I was born. Yeah, bravo. No. All right. 1 minute. I'll get there. All right. To speak of the features of the Jewish shareholders, we've divided it up, as you can see here, between total population, geography, occupation, and major shareholders. What we mean by major shareholders are those shareholders who had interests, shares in more than one joint stock company of the 54 that we were able to identify. One must also say that of these 54, 54 out of a total database of joint stock company startups, in other words, creations of joint stock companies over a period of 100 years, which were in excess of how many do we have? 500 plus. So, so I just want to give a kind of notice to the dimensions of what we're dealing with in terms of we have 500 plus creations of joint stock companies over this 100 period, and out of that we have 54 that had a Jewish presence. Well, we've made a mistake. Well,
sorry, it's my mistake, because I said 500. So yes.
My mother said I was very special. Jewish shareholders in joint stock company startups, as we said, can be taxonomized basically in two categories. Natural persons and pre-existing family-based, usually partnership firms. The total belonging to the first category, namely natural persons, are 154, and in the second, in other words, partnership firms, 22. So, here we are. I'll get there eventually. The practice whereby a Jewish partnership would appear as a founding shareholder in a joint stock company seems to have been less popular after 1920, but the total number of Jewish shareholders amounted to about 0.02% of all founding shareholders in joint stock company startups in Greece in the period under review. In other words, that 100-year period between 1830 and 1929. Places of residence. Bravo. Out of the 154 Jewish shareholders that were natural persons, we don't have data for the places of residence in 81 cases, so just over a half. But in any case, and this has got to do with the nature of the nature of the data that we have. These company charters were created and written up by notaries, and there wasn't any standardized practice, as it were, in Greece at a particular time. Each notary, more or less, wrote up the company charter, submitted it eventually for approval. When upon approval, it was published in the Government Gazette of Greece. And so from notary to notary, not all these details, which are important to economic historians, were always given. Among the so we have here the main cities of Salonika, Volos, and Athens. And in terms of numbers, we have 18 shareholders from Salonika, 16 from Volos, and 12 from Athens, and 9 from Corfu and other cities, such as Patras, Piraeus, Ceres, for example. There was also a number of Jewish shareholders which were based outside of Greece. The foreign cities which appear in the data that we have are Alexandria, Constantinople, Sofia in Bulgaria, Rome, Lecce in Italy for some reason, Milan, Paris, Marseille, and Manchester. Obviously, Alexandria, Constantinople, Marseille, and Manchester fit into well-established patterns in terms of not only the Jewish diaspora but also the Greek diaspora. But it's difficult to understand why these other cities appear. The headquarters of the partnerships that were founding shareholders in joint company startups with a Jewish presence are not known for most of the cases. And for the few that provided this information, again, we have Athens, Patras, and also Milan and London. Occupations. Half of the Jewish shareholders that were natural persons did not declare an occupation. So again, we have a gap in the data, as was the case with the aspect of the place of residence or the geography. About 2/3 of Jewish shareholders who declared an actual profession said that they were merchants, and that appears in bullet point 3. The second largest professional group, but much smaller in size, were bankers. There are also listed members of companies, of board of directors. We have 3 housewives, landowners, and insurance agents. And to a much lesser extent, we have the professions of architects, rentiers, real estate agents, industrialists, traders in tobacco, engineers, and doctors. My last point about major shareholders. We have 5 shareholders, in other words, 5 people which appear in at least one or more joint stock company with a Jewish presence. What is particularly noteworthy, with the exception of, as it says there, Erlanger, Erlanger or Erlanger, I don't know how you pronounce the correct one.
Private name was Michael or Moses or something like that? Was it French?
He was. That's the point. It was Emile. Emile Erlanger and company. Yeah. Who are you thinking of?
Okay, not from Paris.
They were initially in Paris, but they also had the family had offices in London.
Yes, that's right. Because their family was in it was a kind of a mystery of Rothschild family. And he was assigned by Rothschild to sign a lot of contracts on land purchase, also in Palestine and in North Africa. So it might be that this kind of connection helps you in
Definitely. With the Jewish Colonization Association.
That's right. Yeah, before,
Even before.
Erlanger family or a particular?
Erlanger is the family name.
Yes, I know, but one Erlanger or all the family were connected?
No, the family. Yeah.
Family, okay.
Yes, right.
The shareholders that we're talking about are Emile Erlanger and Company as a merchant house, Anselmos Mourzoukos.
That's a Volos family.
Indefinitely so. Anselmos Mourzoukos. The Mourzoukos family is famous for a cashmere and wool factory. I don't know what the correct word would be, which was based in Volos and until the 60s operated. It was called Leviathan, as in Greek. There was also Chaim Elias Cohen, Simanto Cohen, and Simantov Levi. Chaim Cohen is an important figure, and here is his picture. I've taken this from the book of Leon Nard, published in Greek recently, about the Jewish members of parliament of Greece. And his family were from, if I remember correctly, from Trikala. They were major bankers in that particular region, and bankers and money lenders, more or less.
They also had big holdings of wheat.
And as dealers in wheat, yeah.
And they were big plots of land to grow wheat.
I suspect for a future historian, if they look at the archives of the Bank of Epiro-Thessalia, which was part of the National Bank of Greece and was specifically created after the annexation of Epirus and Thessaly in 1881, one would find his father quite a lot in the dealings and the correspondence of that particular bank in that particular region. How are we going for time? I've kind of digressed and okay. What is getting back to Erlanger? What is particularly noteworthy in this group of 5 is that, with the exception of Erlanger, all of them are in some way connected to the world of pre-1912 Old Greece. The words Old Greece in inverted commas. Both Mourzoukos and Levy are resident in Volos and chose to invest in joint stock companies based in their cities of residence. Olympos Cement in Volos, the Bank of Thessaly, Leviathan Mourzoukos, the Commercial Club of Volos. While in the cases of Chaim Cohen and Simanto Cohen, their connections are through their family or the headquarters of their business. Although Chaim Cohen was elected as an MP for the city of Salonika in 1915, and at the time he invested in 2 joint stock companies, the Agrarian Bank of Greece and the Reconstruction Company for Greece, he was a resident of that city. And despite the fact that he was a resident in Salonika, his origins lay in the town of Trikala, where he and his family were local bankers, historically speaking. Similarly, Simanto Cohen had, according to one news report, which was not particularly favorable, he had Bulgarian citizenship, but judging from a number of other sources, he appears to have remained a kind of import-export merchant dealing in grain from the Black Sea region, and in particular this port of Burgas in Bulgaria, and was based in Piraeus in the early 20th century, well until the 1930s. I was able to find him more or less through commercial guides and through that very useful and underused source, the telephone book. We actually have telephone books from the 1920s still in Greece, so I was able to find an address of his business and a personal address as well. Coming to the conclusion, and in terms of the evolution of the Jewish presence in the nascent corporate sector, my argument and the argument Professor Pepelassis and I have tried to put forward is that we can discern 2 specific periods in terms of 2 phases. The first covers the period 1830 to 1901, where Jewish presence was very limited, and it predominated, and it predominantly involved 3 non-Greek, that is to say, established outside of Greece, and well-known European banking families, namely the Rothschilds, the Hambros, and the Erlanger. The Rothschilds were involved in the bank loan, the foreign bank loan, which Professor Pepelassis referred to at the beginning, and they were also major shareholders in the first Bank of Greece, the National Bank of Greece, established in 1841, together with various other large investors as well, one of them being the king, and various other so-called Philhellenes. Another good case being Jean-Gabriel Eynard, a Swiss, Geneva-based banker, for example. The second period is 1912 to 1929. The Jewish presence was much more extensive, especially after the 1920s, and it basically involved local Jews, local Greek Jews. The 1920s reflected to a certain degree the peak that we have, a more generalized peak in the establishment of joint stock companies in Greece at that particular time. And also at the end of this period, we have the first companies which had 100% Jewish ownership. So in closing, I wanted to say that we shouldn't overlook this particular body of investors because they represented Jews of diverse occupational, sectional, and geographical origins. They involve cooperation and members of a local Greek and also diaspora elite, and indeed wider European Jewry. And so, in a sense, this particular subset of that larger and broader context of entrepreneurship, our particular data set fits into that broader category. And I wanted to close by going back to where we started and to Professor Pepelassis' comments about Hambros. And about the fact that we have large Jewish banking families involved from the beginning in the case of Greece, involved in entrepreneurial activities, obviously with the Rothschilds, but then later we have the Hambros and the Elangers involved in the exploitation, for example, of and the building of railways in Greece in the 1880s, and so on and so forth. And we also have the other element. We have elements, people of the Greek diaspora, people like Stefanos Xenos, Andreas Ingros, and Dimitris Vikelas. All of these people were involved, and we have it in their memoirs, had deep and personal connections with various European Jewish banking families. One particular case which stands out is the relationship of Andreas Ingros to the Camondo family, the famous family of Galata of Istanbul, and also in the case of Vikelas and in Sigros, we have their connections to Hermann Oppenheim, who were very well known German Jewish banking family, heavily involved in the foreign loans of Khedive Egypt. So on that particular point, I wanted to end and to just by broadening out and seeing the picture that we've tried to portray here in its wider European and Eastern Mediterranean context. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yes, that we have dedicated this paper to David Landis. Sorry? It's already published, but we are going to. It's in a Greek volume,
No.
University of
Okay.
Milan.
A new book by
Sorry,
Oh, text.
you have it here?
I have it here.
Yeah.
It was brought out by Isnafi in Ioannina in 2016, and the Greek title is Εβραϊκές κοινότητες ανάμεσα σε Ανατολή και Δύση, Οικονομία, Κοινωνία, Πολιτική, Πολιτισμός, and it's a bilingual title. As far as I know, the National Library of Israel doesn't have a copy yet, so our Israeli friends, that's a hint to you.
Okay, we'll go on and we collect the questions toward the end of the because actually the whole session has to do with economic, and it was a very good start and very interesting one. And now we are moving on with the Evangelia Mathupoulou. And by the way, everyone got the biography of all of the presenters, so I don't have to repeat anything. But I would like to stress that her PhD actually was on the Jewish presence in British Cyprus from 1878 to 1949, and actually, as I said in the very beginning of this conference, Evangelia is the heart behind this conference. So relax a little bit; it's almost to be finished. So I'm very proud to invite you to present your paper, please. Fresh water.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Professor Benartzi. Before I start, I have to say that this element of Jewish integration that Professor Pepelassis has mentioned in the Greek case, it is evident also in Cyprus. And the Jewish businessmen did not only establish startups, new business, but they passed them on to the Greek Cypriots. So we have this entrepreneurial transfer of, business tactics which survive in Cyprus. Now, the 1920s were marked by a steady inflow of Jewish affluent migrants from the USA and Europe to mandate Palestine. The Jewish entrepreneurs embraced the national aspiration of the return to Zion and comprised the force of economic modernization of the future Jewish state. However, protectionism in the 1930s led some of those entrepreneurs to redefine their strategy in business activity, as Palestine was left outside the imperial trading zone. As the case of Cyprus shows, they expanded their entrepreneurial networks in the Eastern Mediterranean in order to gain back access to the British market by establishing commercial companies on neighboring British ground. Mandate Palestine, due to her frequent shipping service with the UK, was nothing more than the hub which kept connected the Jewish entrepreneurs with European markets, while Cyprus was the place where trading products were manufactured and exported. The paper seeks to shed light on the business expansion of Palestinian Jews to the colony of Cyprus, arguing that the process of nation building had decisively shaped Jewish business tactics in the region. The motives of entrepreneurial movement were not purely economic, as we used to know about Jewish business. It entailed ideological parameters as well. Evidence will be drawn from the cases of Jews who demonstrated business activity in the geographical triangle of Palestine, Egypt, and Cyprus. Scholars have so far approached the case of Jewish entrepreneur in modern Mediterranean in the context of Zionist state building and in the lens of Western colonialism and European consumerism, portraying him as a liaison in the flow of raw materials and luxury goods trade from the British colonies to metropolis and Europe. The presentation enhances both historiographical interpretations, advancing the argument that ideological and economic incentives in Jewish entrepreneurial activity in the 1930s were more than ever interwoven. The business practices of Jews in the region were nurtured by imperial protectionist policy of Great Britain, but at the same time derived from a necessity to forge the national ideal through business infiltration in adjacent to Palestine areas. Until the 1920s, Palestine's major trading partners in the region were Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, where edible oils, soap, wine, sheep and goat skins, vegetables, and fruits were exported. Palestine's trade suffered from time to time from a deficit and the difficulty of reaching new markets, especially since Palestinian commodities were discriminated with high tariff imposed by her neighbors. Furthermore, Palestine's trade was carried out by foreign ships, as no Jewish maritime activity existed then. Until then. However, with the influx of Jewish immigrants, the Palestinian export trade was orientated to Western European markets. The combination of production and export was central to the economic thought of Zionist immigrants, who contributed to the acceleration of Palestinian economic growth in the interwar period as a means of strengthening the national cause. The Jewish private sector of Palestine engaged largely with the export trade, embarking upon a grand scheme of excessive citrus cultivation along the coastal plains of Palestine. Their ultimate purpose was the building of a prosperous citrus export trade. Soon, Palestine's main source of revenue came from citrus industry, whose production was exported to Great Britain. Sporadic cases of industrial export products, such as artificial teeth, whose production was impressively developed in Palestine during the 1920s and reached Jewish trade to Western European markets. Already plagued by competition from other Mediterranean citrus producers, such as Spain and Italy, the Palestinian citrus trade was exposed to a potential risk when Great Britain decided not to extend imperial preference to Palestine in December 1932. Other major citrus exporters to Great Britain, namely the USA, Italy, Spain, and Brazil, objected fervently to the extension of tariff privileges to Palestine and any mandated territory. For those Palestinian Jewish orange growers and entrepreneurs who traded with Great Britain, these developments equated with a loss of privileged access to their principal trading partner. The Jewish businessmen adapted quite rapidly to the new situation, with the local exporters channeling their trade to Eastern European countries. However, some others preferred to create new trading routes in order to gain back their access to the British market by establishing offshore companies on British ground in the Mediterranean. This strategy was demonstrated in the case of Cyprus. The island served more or less as a business exodus for Jewish Palestinian entrepreneurs, as it appeared to offer substantial economic advantages, the most important being the preferential status of trading duty-free materials and exporting low-cost manufactured goods. The prospects of Cyprus trade with Britain, were encouraging, as the latter was gradually becoming the most important market for Cyprus' economy, especially with regard to certain commodities which fell within the imperial preference system, such as oranges and products manufactured from local or colonial raw materials. The Palestinian enterprises were exposed to competition from the emerging neighboring citrus industry of Cyprus, especially at a time that the island's oranges had the advantage of 10% preference, which was not applicable to the Palestinian oranges. Additionally, citrus fruits were becoming of increasing importance and represented one of the most hopeful avenues of development on the island. The different levels of economic development also seem to have enhanced the business mobility between the two places. While Cyprus was experiencing the consequences of Great Depression, Palestinian economy was one of the few economies in the world that actually realized a rapid economic growth, emerging as by far the most vibrant Middle Eastern economy. Cyprus was cheaper in land and labor, as the cost of living in Palestine was fundamentally higher than its neighboring territories due to the rise in numbers of capital and human capital. The wages also of skilled workers in agriculture varied between 100 and 130 Palestine meals, while in Cyprus only 72 meals. In manufacturing, the skilled worker in Palestine varied between 125 and 146 meals, while in Cyprus 110 meals. And that of the unskilled worker even lower, around 65 meals. Furthermore, the cheaper land prices encouraged the land purchases for business reasons. While in the 1930s the average price of land in Palestine was 4.9 Palestine pounds per dönum, in Cyprus varied from 18 shillings to 2 pounds per dönum. It's a big difference. The Jewish Palestinian merchants, foreseeing the commercial potentialities of the British colony, did not hesitate, therefore, to establish a business network with the neighboring island, investing in citrus industry as well as in industrial manufacturing. In Cyprus, the Jews engaged in the production of commodities that benefited highly from imperial tariff policy and consumed in Western European markets. The Jewish trade from Cyprus to Great Britain included oranges, grapefruits, and raisins, as well as certain industrial products such as batons and artificial teeth, which were manufactured from raw materials imported from other British colonies. The newspaper Palestine Post commented in August 1934 that the fiscal attractions of Cyprus outweighed the idealistic attributes of Palestine. Can we argue that this was the case? It appears that the economic benefits were not the sole reasons for Jewish commercial expansion in the region. The business activity of the Jews was not confined to a speculative trade. As the case of Cyprus demonstrates, the Jewish business interests went hand in hand with nationalist-guided considerations. The Nazi expulsion of Jews from Germany commenced in 1933, and the forthcoming massive Jewish movement to Palestine aroused severe concerns in the circles of the Jewish Agency, which was aware of the British intention to place quotas in the numbers of Jews allowed to enter the territory. So it started exploring alternatives. One solution was the economic penetration of Jewish entrepreneurs in neighboring places such as Cyprus, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as an alternative to Palestine, or otherwise as a means of creating Jewish-friendly settlements where migratory waves of German and Austrian Jews could be diverted. As soon as the restricting British immigration policy was to be reversed, the plan was to encourage the immigrants to settle in Palestine. Arthur Rubin, chairman of the Jewish Agency, traveled to Cyprus in 1935 and stressed emphatically in his report on the trip that as long as there was Jewish capital and people destined for Palestine, the Palestinian Jews were obliged to do their utmost in order to transfer and settle people and money there. However, a small-scale migration of Jews in Cyprus was not excluded, as, I quote, "From a Palestinian view, a yishuv in Cyprus would be more interesting than a yishuv in Brazil or Uruguay." And here we have an explanation of the reasoning behind the relocation of business activity to Cyprus by the owners of the Cyprus Farming Company, a short-lived agricultural company that operated in Kouklea Famagusta from 1933 to 1939. And Professor Benarzi mentioned yesterday. According to the document, I quote, "A Jewish settlement in neighboring areas of Palestine means to us today a reinforcement and not a danger. Without neglecting our work on Palestine, someone can start a business in neighboring areas which is about to strengthen our position and to create new and safer markets for the Palestinian industry. Therefore, a unique opportunity of both economic and ideological significance emerged for Jewish entrepreneurs to gain access to neighboring territories of Palestine in view of the much anticipated establishment of a Jewish national home." As will be argued next, it's not surprising that the owners of the largest companies founded in Cyprus after 1933 were affluent immigrants with strong Zionist-orientated background. Between 1933 and 1939, Jewish individuals and corporate companies were established in the eastern and northern coastal Cyprus at the ports of Famagusta, Larnaca and Limassol, roughly in a distance of 200 miles from Palestine. The settlement selection was one based on the soil suitability for citrus cultivation and the proximity to the main ports of the island. More than 70 Jewish individuals who ran big private orange groves settled extensively in the suburbs of Famagusta. The port of Famagusta appeared to have strong perspectives in citrus export trade, with natural advantages unrivaled in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its importance in Palestine's commercial connections became more than obvious in 1935 when the Romanian Jew Eliezer Bergovici, owner of the Palestine Maritime Lloyd Limited, launched a new steamer line from Haifa to Constanza on Black Sea via Beirut, Tripoli, Famagusta, and Istanbul. The Har Zion ship could transfer about 2,000 tons of cargo, mainly citrus, cattle, and wood. One of those entrepreneurs, also that settled in Famagusta, was a woman who left a legacy in Famagusta. Ida Pershitz, called by the locals Elsperchena, was the owner of one of the biggest orchards and a successful businesswoman. The words of her daughter Ruth in an interview in the Greek Cypriot newspaper Alithia depicts the importance of the Famagusta port for these individuals. I quote, "It wasn't easy to export from Palestine. Therefore, she decided to come to Cyprus, where the exports to Europe were easier to be materialized. On the island, she met the landowner, Yanos Christofidis from Famagusta, who guided her to buy land. Morphou, even though a nice area to cultivate, she was far away from the main port of Famagusta. Her final decision was then to buy land in Varosi." Simon Ambash, the chief engineer of the Suez Canal Company and an affluent Zionist Jew in Cairo, he was the father actually of Aura Herzog, the wife of the 6th president of Israel, along with 13 other shareholders from Palestine, were the first Jews to embark on a large-scale commercial scheme in Cyprus. The Cyprus Palestine Plantations Company Limited was established in Limassol in July 1933. Its main aim was to launch an intensive production of citrus which would be exported to Great Britain. Networked in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the company's capital base was in Cairo. The offices for its trading facilities were run in Alexandria and Tel Aviv, while production was taking place in Limassol. The center of the business activity in Limassol was Fassouri, a chieftain of 3,000 dunams. You can... Here, this is the area. This chieflicht was suitable soil for citrus cultivation, located in the western edge of the town in a distance of not less than 10 miles from the port. By 1940, less than a decade of its existence, the company became the leading enterprise in the production, grading, packing, and export of citrus on the island. With its trademark selected Cyprus oranges, the seal of quality, 95% of the company's commodities were destined to Great Britain and the rest to Scandinavia and Egypt. The company's export trade to British market was further enriched with the industrial production of a principal ingredient of British pudding, the raisins, which were produced from sultana grapes drying. Due to its increasing export volume, the company soon acquired its own jetty next to the Limassol Pier, which facilitated the uninterrupted loading of commodities on the steamers to London. The interesting part of the case of the Cyprus Plantation Company is that the the business owners engaged in excessive land purchases in Limassol and Larnaca, as among their objectives were to acquire, cultivate, improve and develop lands on the island, to sell and undertake the cultivation and plantation of such lands. We are not in a position now to argue that the CPP had indeed employed the strategy of Jewish investors in Palestine in the 1920s, who first founded private plantation companies and some year later Jewish settlements developed next to their estates, for the reason that the company files at the Central Zionist Archives are not open to the public. Evidence, however, on land sales from the CPP to Jews coming from Palestine, Western and Central Europe in Limassol and Larnaca between 1935 and 1939 from the Department of Land and Surveys in Cyprus enhances the argument that the company's commercial presence in Cyprus served a scheme for the realization of Jewish settlements outside Palestine. More than 850 dunams of land were sold to Jewish individuals in the nearby area of Akrotiri. This is the various villages next to Fasuri plantations. Small, some are chiefliks, others are small villages. A more prevailing case of Jewish activity had been the establishment of two export industries in Larnaca by the families of Blooms and Feinsteins. Samuel Simon Bloom, a Lithuanian Jew who migrated to Philadelphia during the 1880s and moved to Palestine in the 1920s, represented a case of both industrial migrant and Zionist affluent. In 1926, he settled in Tel Aviv, where he founded the industry for the manufacture and export of porcelain artificial teeth, the American Porcelain Tooth Company, contributing to the business development of the Yishuv and enhancing Zionist capitalism. By 1930, the industry produced about 20,000 teeth a day, which were exported to more than 12 destinations worldwide, including Britain. The only way Bloom could circumvent the unpleasant impacts of protectionism was to move his production on a British ground. Therefore, in August 1934, he established a second line of artificial teeth manufactured, the Empire Dental Industry Limited in Larnaca. As David De Vries argues, Bloom's decision of offshoring in Larnaca was a case of capital relocation that can be hardly conceived as an expression of ambivalence toward their professed Zionism. The Empire Dental Industry undertook the operation task of the company in Palestine, namely the cheap production of artificial teeth from imported raw materials like porcelain from Canada, gold and platinum from England, and their export to British markets and Denmark via Great Britain. The preferential status of its production enabled the company to reach 56 markets worldwide. Alexander Apostolidis will get more into the case of the Dominion Manufacturing Company next, which is the second industrial business, Jewish business, which was founded in Cyprus in the 1930s. So, to sum up, the case of the Jewish entrepreneurs in Cyprus in the 1930s could be dealt as an early manifestation of the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean for the State of Israel. A window to the West, an open door to Europe for business and even culture. Profoundly, the impulse for bridging Jewish regional business connections derived from Zionist as well as economic considerations. It appears that the ideological angle, which was absent from earlier diaspora networks, formed the emerging business links in the region. The interwar period marked the rise of a Zionist business culture, which still appeared to have a heavy dependence on British markets. As early as the 1930s, the Eastern Mediterranean provided those entrepreneurs with a geographical space that enabled them to extend their business networks beyond Palestine, and at the same time to prepare the ground for alternative non-permanent refuge for the Jews expelled from Central Europe. The economic growth of Palestinian economy versus the retarded Cyprus economy created favorable business conditions to realize their target. Last, some characteristics of traditional Jewish business patterns were brought to the region, as the Jewish businessmen were still distinguished for their diaspora networking. You can see here the case of the Dominion Manufacturing Company and its networking throughout the world, and their intermediary role in the flow of raw materials and commodities inside the British Empire and in global context. Thank you so much.
Very much, Evangelia. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, we're moving on now to the last speaker of the meeting, actually, and then we'll have some time to discuss the whole session, which is a very interesting one. Are you ready? Try to be. And it's another joint paper, actually, of Evangelia, which we just heard, and Professor Apostolidis. You missed it?
Sorry, we have a small...
You have a problem?
Yeah, just exactly what you need at the end of a very long day.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Please let me first allow me to thank the organizers, and if we can have a round of applause for the organizers being the last one. So thank you very much for this. Especially because I think we have so much history, but so much to gain from each other. And thanks to the people that I know best, so Evangelia and George, thank you so much. I hope we can still cooperate as we do. This is a project that we started with Evangelia. What's really good is she covered a lot of ground, so I think I will be able to be a lot shorter, and we can go to dinner. I'm an economic historian. I did, Jacob Metzer was one of my idols, so I did GDP of Cyprus in the interwar period and tried to do the divided economy and see if it exists in that model as he did for Palestine, only to figure out that that doesn't really exist for Cyprus at the same time. So, and out of that, today I want to do two things. I want to talk about the Dominion Baton Company because it's just fascinating, and explain the title, and also really start thinking about the things that Evangelia already talked about, which is what do tariffs do, right? So let's start with what do tariffs do? So what's the idea of putting a tariff? The idea of putting a tariff is that you have industrialists coming to you and saying that not having a tariff destroys your nation, right? There's a lot of hypotheses that say if you want to industrialize, you need to put a big tariff wall, and then you allow us to compete, and then it turns our nations into industrial powerhouses. And we forget that, but for both Israel, Cyprus, and quite a lot of other areas, that was the orthodoxy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, until it collapsed, because it really didn't work. And what we want to find out is, even though there wasn't a theory around it before, tariffs were definitely there. Tariffs were there for this same purpose, and also for political purposes as well, right? So I was really interested in understanding whether this this tariff barrier that the empire had, what real effects did it do in our neighborhood, right? And that's the starting point. There is a big conference in 1932, there's the imperial preference being put on, and suddenly there's areas of the empire, the formal empire, who have a tariff preference, so a smaller tariff to the UK, and the informal empire is outside. So it's not just the Mandate of Palestine, it's also areas like Sudan are suddenly, although they're part of this large informal empire, they're not part of this formal empire, and suddenly they have this barrier to trade, a quite substantial tariff. Okay, so what's interesting in looking on this is that actually there's a huge debate that's still ongoing whether tariffs worked or not. But what we're really interested is, okay, how did this tariff really affect our neighborhood? How did they affect areas like the Mandate of Palestine, which was outside, and how did it affect Cyprus, which was just inside? Okay. And what we're basically going to say is there is no evidence that tariffs really work, not even in this period. They work in a temporal way, in an ephemeral way. So what really works is technology. So if you get a really new, cheap way to produce beer, you get breweries, right? Whether there's tariffs or not, you'll get breweries, right? The type of business that seems to be attracted from, at least with our case study, which we have a lot of information about and we can talk why, from the Mandate of Palestine to Cyprus, is just an ephemeral one. They're just here to play with the tariffs, right? So as soon as this advantage goes, the industry goes. It's not really the type of sustained industrialization you'd like to see. So why do we know a lot about the Dominion Baton Company? Because it collapses in a spectacular way. If you've seen the news of Carillion, this is the Carillion of the day. It really is. The official receiver had to step in and appoint auditors to close the company because the company collapsed without any books. So this is Carillion. It's exactly what the official receiver did in the UK a couple of weeks ago, right? So we have a lot of information. And actually, the more we looked at it, and we started combining the historical archives in the Bank of Cyprus and the newspapers, we even found physical manifestations of the collapse, which we can show. But what this allows us to do is we've got so much information, which you usually would have in private archives, if you were lucky, or which usually gets lost. And it's not of a success, it's of a spectacular collapse, right? So it gives us a nice understanding. So let's set the scene. The DMC's, Dominion Manufacturing Company, gets set up in 1936. This is a letter in 1938. And behind the whole process is Raymond Feinstein, who also had a connection, Evangelia will correct me if I'm wrong, this is based on Evangelia's work, with the dental company as well. The board is all of basically Feinstein's associates or family members. And notice the capital is actually quite short if you want to build a factory. Okay, there's a lot of less inflation than today, but that's not really the sort of capital that you can build a factory with, right? Note also that last company, Overseas Supplies Limited, because it becomes important. From the beginning, I think Evangelia covered that. Yeah, I think Evangelia covered this as well, so I'm going to... Do you want the push and pull? No, yeah. From the beginning, the idea of this company was basically to play with the tariffs. And what was their problem? This really ugly looking thing on the left is a dome nut that's produced in Sudan. And before plastics, those were the buttons that the dome nut would produce. Now, Sudan is outside the imperial preference that's established by Britain in 1932. So if you import it directly, or if you process it in Sudan, and you put the factory in Sudan, you get charged a high tariff. You can't do it in the Mandate of Palestine either, because exactly it's also outside the imperial preference system, and you're also competing with French, Japanese, and Italian producers. They have the same tariff, a high tariff. So where can you put the factory? Well, put it on Cyprus, and suddenly Cyprus has a preferential tariff that in the beginning is 24% difference. So it's 34% if you're outside, it's 10% tariff if you're inside. So there's a substantial tariff difference to do it in Cyprus. But, and again, this is why this is a lovely case study. From the beginning, you can understand it's an ephemeral business. From the beginning, the business is trying to find myriad of ways, right, to basically push the Cypriot colonial government to bend the rules, right? What they really want to do is put a factory in the Sudan, yeah? But they can't. So they're constantly finding new ways of adding value of them being present in Cyprus. One of them is they ask for a full monopoly of buttons on the island. But there are other local capital also producing buttons and producing button factories. So that's rejected. So then they constantly lobby the government, right, to allow this raw material to come in tariff-free. And when they receive this, they then lobby the government to allow semi-processed buttons, well, button raw material from Sudan. So what do you see? You do see Jewish interests here investing in Cyprus, but their investment was clearly because they wanted to play with this tariff, right? I mean, this is speculative. In this case, I really don't think, Evangelia, it's the ideological thing. There are people who were already in Cyprus. These are people that saw an opportunity and said, let's milk it as much as we can, right? At least on 2 occasions, the UK government has to step in and force the Cypriot colonial government, right, to stop giving favors to this company. And a famous example is in that should be 1939, not 1931, right? In 1941, the company says, oh, you know, we've got a war on, so how about we semi-process the nuts in Sudan, and then we can finish them here, and then bring them to the UK or India. And the UK says, well, that actually violates the rule of origin, right? You only get a preferential treatment if basically the manufacturing happens in the colony, right? So they keep finding different ways. And actually the government is basically censured by the UK Department of Trade for taking liberties. So you see a very, very close connection of the colonial government and this company. I mean, here you have the actual governor almost begging the British government to allow semi-processed, to allow basically to change classification of the rules and allow Cypriot buttons to exist. So let's talk a bit about the actual Dominion Manufacturing Company now and see why it's really an ephemeral business. Unlike other, we heard about the idea, we know that there's a lot of Jewish capital going in Israel, in the Mandate of Palestine at this time, and there was this idea that maybe this capital gets deflected partly in Cyprus for the reasons that Evangelia said. And that might be true for everything else. It's not really true for this. Capital is very limited, 3,000, and then a banker and a representative of the Ionian Bank get appointed in a very ceremonial role on the board, and then they design a preferential share. I would call it basically something like a Ponzi scheme, right? Whereby locals could get preferential shares that didn't have voting rights, but these shares would give you profits that were guaranteed. So it would say basically, I would give you 6% of the total profits of the company in a year. If I don't have profits in the first year, in the second year, I'll take account that I didn't give you in the first year. And these preferential shares raise £340,000 at the moment of collapse. So really, we're talking about a company that what is really bringing in is Jewish expertise and also Jewish financial engineering, right? But not really Jewish capital. Right? Notice there is an innovation here. I haven't ever seen a company doing this complicated financial product at this moment in time. Okay? It's also from the beginning incredibly spread out and has connections with companies across the world, but they're all controlled by the same people, the Feinsteins. So, and that's important later on. The company really wasn't making a profit, but something happened, the Second World War. And there's a beautiful letter where the Indian government is complaining about how terrible the baton quality is, and then orders 3 million of them, right? Because the demand of military material outstrips the supply. The profits are suddenly enormous, but you sold all this capital, this financial product to the locals, so you need to give it back, right? So suddenly you show a lot of profits because you were basically needed to show profits to give these people profits back and get some profits out. But what happens? There's a cycle. Oh my God, this company is making enormous profits. Well, they had to pay back their preferential shareholders in order to make some profit themselves, the Feinstein Group. But by doing that, everybody else wants to invest in it, and everybody else has money to invest in it because, of course, Cyprus was not part of the direct conflict. And from the moment the Middle East Supply Center gets established, there is essentially a monopoly of Cyprus providing batons from here to India, right? When there was this network established. So the company shows enormous profits, gets enormous new investors in it, and then very quickly after the war, it collapses. Okay, red is when it's actually in the red. How big was this company? Well, actually, it employed an enormous amount of people for the Cypriot industrial class, right? I haven't found, and I've tried, I haven't found another company except the mines that employed so many people in an industry, right? We've got the data, the aggregate data, and even big companies like winemaking and beer production are in the 200s range. And here we see a company that employs up to 700, 800 people at times. Yeah, 700, and I just 800 is the peak, right? First Larnaca, and then I think they established a smaller place in Limassol. But basically, yes. The war ends, and the first thing the UK does, decides a total ban of imports. So really, this tariff advantage disappears overnight. Italian and Japanese batons re-enter the market. Why? Because now there is no war, right? And that should be batons. I don't know why Apple says. Sorry, must have been reading an article about Apple, right? And suddenly everybody, plastic was the new thing. Plastic was used. Ample. Yeah, absolutely right. It was ample, I wanted to say. So plastic is the new thing. Everyone wants plastic. No one had plastic because of war production. The war ends. Suddenly everyone wants plastic batons. So how did the Feinstein Group try to deal with it? 4 ways. Try to find new markets. It created a plastic baton company, but there was no expertise on making batons. Right? It tried to come to value-added batons, mother-of-pearl batons. I think in Greek we call it nisafi, right? Nisafi batons. And fraud. Right? It literally, the Feinstein Group, I say that because it's not only him, but I think it's clear that he was the leader, and actually the government, the colonial government of Cyprus hired a young Kliridis lawyer who actually became a president of Cyprus to see if there were actually criminal cases against Feinstein himself. And he decided that the law didn't allow for that to happen. But Feinstein develops a fraud, which is actually genius. You see all those companies there? They're all controlled by him. So he is actually setting up a really complicated, modern financial system where all the buying and selling is of companies he controls. So he can always show massive sales of batons that no one wants. So for 2 or 3 years, he keeps getting investors. Then investors dry up because the profits dry up. And then he gets enormous loans from local and international banks, right? Showing them, but I'm selling tremendous amounts of batons. Sadly, all the batons go to the overseas supply company, which belongs to him, and they can't sell even a single one, right? So through basically showing sales that don't exist, Feinstein first gets local investment, and then gets local banks to finance this company, which was pretty much doomed because it couldn't get basic things right. And what do I mean basic things right? Well, when they tried to do mother of pearl buttons, they just broke the buttons. They had real failure. Mother of pearl buttons is not with nuts anymore, it's with actual shell. It's harder, they kept breaking them. Consequences. Feinstein leaves in the night. He announces to his workers that he's going to get new machines from the UK and closes the factory and then never comes back. Okay? People start wondering what happened. There's chaos in the factory and the official receiver intervenes. The loss of capital to private individuals was 340,000. We calculated, what, 122 million in today's euros? It collapsed in 1949. 48 really. The winding up takes a while, and the total winding up is the 50. But he runs away in 48, right? And he owes to Bank of Cyprus 274,000 pounds of loans, right? Meanwhile, the assets of the company were stripped in the last 2 years to other companies that Feinstein was controlling. And Bank of Cyprus had a hell of a time trying to figure out how to get it back. Okay? What I really love here is the last one, where it basically says, yes, I did resign from Bank of Cyprus Larnaca because there were allegations that I was giving too many loans and I got backpack payments, but all those are false. I actually called it Mother of Pearls Wrapped in Concrete because this is an actual story where, thanks to Evangelia's help and thanks to the help of the head of the historical archive of Bank of Cyprus and the former head, we actually found the buttons, the broken buttons. So what happened was, when Bank of Cyprus opened the boxes that they had as guarantee for all the loans, they saw there were actually correct buttons, beautiful buttons at the top, and broken shells at the bottom, right? So they were defrauded over 174,000, which was trade acceptance. They were giving loans for acceptance in broken shells. And in the effort to make a profit out of it, the new CEO, Garanis, right, put it as a building material to make concrete look prettier. This is actually in the archive building across, and when you actually scratch it, you can see mother of pearl broken with evidence of it going through the machine. This is the banker trying to make, as we'll say it now, something out of the non-performing loan it got. Mandate of the then state of Israel, and he never came back. No, the colony of Cyprus gave Kliridis, paid Kliridis to see if they could actually prosecute, and he decided that the law, because it was a complicated financial engineering product, the law didn't really cover the government to be able to do something about it. I have no idea. I have no idea. Do you know? No, we have no idea. What? R. Feinstein. I forgot. Evangelion. R. Feinstein, right? What's his first name? Raymond, yes. Conclusions. This case study is fun. Right? It's fun because also it's an enormously complicated financial fraud. Right? It also shows another thing about entrepreneurs we don't say. They have loads of skills that might not be just in doing things, in setting up finance, and even in fraud. Okay? In terms of wider implications, though, it has wider implications. This second order, this foreign direct investment that goes to Cyprus rather than Israel, is for many different reasons, right? And come back to your point, a lot of industrialization was going to happen anyway. Those industrialization that happens because of tariffs is usually ephemeral. is usually something ILO, right? It comes, it goes somewhere else when the tariffs move, right? Narrower, it shocked me to see that capital inflow was so low. It's just a case study, and there's other case studies where Jewish interests are buying a lot of land, and there's capital inflow. But the interaction between local capital and Jewish interests, we never knew about. And here there's a clear case that there was an enormous interaction. It could be only on this case, but we need to reconsider how much the actual capital was being interacted as well, and the interactions between the local community. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we put some light? So there are, I guess, a lot of questions for these three fantastic presentations.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the organizers and the speakers. Very interesting conference. For me, it's of interest the Jewish-Muslim relations. I have spoken already with Evangelia. And do we know anything about Jewish-Muslim relations on all levels? In Cyprus, in Greece, in Europe? Thank you very much.
That's only for Palestine in the same period. And if you take just Haifa, there were hundreds. In the case of Haifa and in Jaffa and Jerusalem, there were hundreds of cooperation between Jews and Muslims and Christian Arabs. Jewish Arab commercial in industry, in agriculture, in banking, in everything you want, and especially in Haifa. And it exists until this very day for those who remained. If I take, for example, family Karaman of Haifa, who came from Nablus to Haifa, and they were working with the Jewish entrepreneurs from 1920 until last minute, because they remained. But there were many others who came from Beirut, who came from Cairo, and that was I mean, it even persisted when times were awful in Palestine. Still, a lot of cooperative business took place in building, in the shipyard, in whatever you want. Cyprus, only about agriculture, about the cooperation. But they know better. Yeah, please. Where is the mic? Oh, there. Oh, you can come here. Okay, you can come.
Thank you, Mrs. Demosthenes. Indeed, there's a lack of research in the field of the relationships between Muslims, between Turks of Cyprus and Jews. With regard to the business, the Jewish business, I haven't come across with any evidence about cooperation with the Turks of Cyprus, with Muslims, between Muslims and the Jews. And maybe Professor Pepelassis would like to add.
Well, we know that Andreas Singeros, one of the most prominent diaspora merchant entrepreneurs and banker, cooperated with the Ottoman state. He acted as renting taxes. He rented taxes from the Ottoman state. He collaborated with the army, and the Ottoman debt. Exactly, he sold the internal Ottoman debt abroad, made a lot of money out of that. And then reading Boudosakis, who came from Asia Minor, reading his autobiography, his biography recently, there are indications that he did collaborate with Muslims when he was in Asia Minor. I mean, it's only natural that they would have. But more research has to be done on that.
In the joint stock companies that we looked at, I only remember from memory, only 2 companies in their lists of shareholders had what I would say to be Ottoman Turkish names, and they were specifically connected to the region of Thessaly, which became part of Greece as a consequence of the Congress of Berlin, delayed obviously until 1881. There needs to be a lot of research done, especially after the incorporation of Epirus and Thessaly in 1881, and also the incorporation of Macedonia in 1912, 1913, because until the exchange of populations in the case of Asia Minor catastrophe and the selling of the Chiflik in Thessaly and the departure of the Ottoman Tiflikadas, as they called the Tiflik owners, there hasn't been much research done. Tiflikadas, it's a Greek expression for the owners, from Chiflik. It's a Hellenization of the Turkish word.
So Chiflik.
Tiflikas meaning the owner.
Chiflik, okay, go ahead. Yeah, that's okay.
So,
Okay,
oh,
so
wait, no. I just want to add, like from the first one. So you had like from the 1840s, you had a Garfield Jewish diaspora in Manchester. It was part of the Industrial Revolution there, and there were cotton merchants. So that's the beginning of the list. In Alexandria, you had all sorts of Jews from called the Greek Peninsula, whether from Yanina or Salonika or Corfu, who were big-time merchants. After the 1891 blood libel of Corfu, you have Jews who are migrating from Corfu to Alexandria. So that's where I think they would come in the books. Obviously, from Salonika, you have a lot of names which didn't enter into this. You had old money too, which didn't enter into this because you're talking about the start of the 20s. But you had banking houses like the Amars that invested in Greece. Orly Miron talked about the partnerships. In terms of Muslims, so first of all, you also have the Dumeh. And so,
We're only talking about joint stock companies. The Amar is a very famous one.
right. So in terms of Muslims, it's like you're talking about the 20s specifically. So, but it doesn't include a lot of things. Or, like for example, from Rhodes, which isn't part of Greece, but you had the Alphadeus, bankers who invested and established companies in Athens. Okay, and from this you have the Kalamaros. I don't know where they appear at all, but I know they were industrialists, and they were from Thessaly, and they were also in Egypt. But in terms of the other element from Salonika, so you had a big partner were the Dunmei. You had the Muslims, but they were more on a lower economic class. But of the Dunmei in particular, the 3 sects, the Kapanjis, were very affluent merchants. So even when some had left Salonika earlier, and even after the population exchange in 22, the Kapanjis still had many big interests in the 20s in Greece. So I imagine that they also were stockholders. That's a vacuum, but we're going to come up with all these people who have this Muslim Jewish duality, which is part of it, because this was a city where the mayors were Dunmei. Okay.
let them answer.
Just one answer on that.
Yes, thank you for all this information. Very interesting. Joint stock companies were only a minority of the total companies in Greece. Greek business, even today, is basically partnership-based business. Why do we study joint stock companies and not partnership charters? Because we would need a team of 10 people to go around to all the cities of Greece, to the courts, the commercial courts, in order to get replicas of the partnership foundations. So that's, unfortunately, if you don't look at joint stock companies, you can't write anything about the aggregate level of Greece. You only have business history that concerns specific companies. Yes, limited liability. Limited liability. Société anonyme. Société anonyme. Which, by force, all the Société anonyme, their charters had to be published in the Greek government gazette. Yes, there is a difference between limited liability partnership. No, it can have 3 shareholders and 1 shareholder. It just has limited liability. The monoprosopos Société anonyme. No.
Very interesting lectures. There is one that I was very much interested because of local interest. The one about the Batron factory, and I want to ask the researchers, Apostolis, whether you found evidence from newspapers and even Cypriot newspapers. What was the impact on local population? So mother occurred in Greek Sidef, which is, I think, is a Turkish Sidef. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the morning sessions, which must have been very, very interesting. I don't know whether there was any reference to the visit from Cypriot trade unionists in the 1940s, late 1940s in Israel, when they were visiting kibbutz. So they would establish the same
communal settlements?
Yes.
In Cyprus?
Yes. Whether
You mean like for pearl diving and stuff like that?
and after the war, after the Second World War, there are evidences that they visited Israel and they brought the ideas from Israel, which is an alternative way of economy inspired by socialist ideas. So I don't know whether this was mentioned. It's an area which
the disaster for Larnaca was enormous. In fact, it was so big when they finally liquidated the company in the 1950s, they hired Rex, which is the biggest closed venue they could get. And there's constant references in the press. The trick is, and I see younger people and I say this, never go to the press first. The press always gives you, go to the archive, figure out what's going on, and then go to the press. Because
there's a reporter there.
Yeah. Well, because you get a bad version of it. I didn't have time to show it, but you're absolutely right. They do mention closing for retrofitting the factory, no one in, and there's a constant mention of it. Well, it's local people from Larnaca. Well, the investment, the preferential share wasn't cheap, so it's not your average person. What's very interesting is the connection with the then mayor of Larnaca and also Nicolaou and Stavrinidis, which was the representative of the Ionian Bank as well. It's also interesting to show that the Ionian Bank got all its money back because they moved very quickly in London and got orders. They got nothing, basically. They got peanuts, and when they actually went... But what I really want to focus on, and I think that's very important, is to understand that we have this vision of Cypriots in the 30s of being a bit, hillbilly sticks. They were not. But they definitely saw this investment and didn't understand what they were buying. That's for sure. There's quite a lot of reference in the press, and Bank of Cyprus then runs it as the Munion's Buttons company for a while longer. It's the first time a bank in Cyprus becomes an investment bank. It doesn't do really well, and finally closes down. I'd love to know where the apothekes are. I'd like to know where the factory was.
I was brought up near the area.
Give me a call. We'll go in and I can go
And
to Thematologio.
the reason I came this afternoon to attend the session is your presentation, because I had some memories from my grandparents and my father talking about this factory. It's around, you know, where the district museum is. Larnaca District Museum, Lefkaridis offices. Right, it was around there.
So if you want to put it, the loss of money of everybody together is about 500,000. The GDP at that period was about 20 million. So yeah, it was big, but not enormous.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, Evangelia. You showed the table of the Jewish land purchase in, and it didn't. It was carried out by the British authorities, because some of the activities that you described in your paper and in the last one, some of this, so to speak, Jewish-Palestinian activity brought about a negative attitude from some local politicians and people, which goes back to your paper this morning, and it reminds the almost not the same, but almost the atmosphere of the beginning of the 19th century antagonism to Jewish settlement. Now it was against the Jewish, so to speak, speculation, enterprising, and risking the Cypriot economy, and on account of the people, as exactly maybe your grandparents remind you. And this is why the British authorities initiated this piece of document, which you found, in order to show that actually it's not
No.
878 dunams were purchased by the...
I don't think that the British did that because yeah.
Well, they were supportive, so they have to show that it doesn't risk the local economy, or doesn't put in danger the let's say the ordinary people in Cyprus.
No, I think that was a tool for their administration. I don't think that they just wanted to control the situation for the British administration. I mean, they never used this table as an argument to say to the Cypriots, you know, you are not endangered. It was their tool. It was just for their use.
Reporting to London that the noise is not too awful. It's only, you know, kind of an exchange of reports, maybe between the British officials, not drilled down to the local newspapers, but it was actually escorted those tables.
No, it doesn't have to do with the public opinion, no. Because the British administration from the start, from 1933, started to record all this business, all this Jewish business activity. Okay, just to know where they stand. What was the situation of Jewish presence in Cyprus. The important thing about public opinion is that while in the early 20th century there's, I mean, this immense anti-Semitic feeling in public opinion, there are riots, not riots, there are demonstrations and at the churches in all districts of the island. In the 1930s, despite the fact that there was again this anti-Jewish rhetoric, there were also elements from the public opinion that were philo-Semitic. They argued yeah. Okay, public opinion seems to be a bit divided. Yeah, exactly. But we heard voices that were arguing that you know, we need these people because they will bring technology, they will bring innovation. So there's a recognition of the importance of Jewish business activity in the island.
Letters of the what was the name of the lawyer of the CPPC? What was the name? Limassol.
Limassol. Kakoyannis, maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, Kakoyannis.
Try to protect, to explain that it's good.
Yeah, and some people, they were damaged. I mean, some locals tried to damage, because in the CPP, the holdings of the CPP, the orange groves in Famagusta, there were some minor incidents against Jewish, premises, but not something very important.
Anybody else, please? So you'll be the last one, and then a few words of George, and we'll conclude singing.
I think it was.
It's our national hymn. You can sing yours.
It was really an interesting session, really, all of you. I have two questions, actually. The first one, you said, you mentioned that Raymond Feinstein fled to Israel. Are you sure about that? Because, yeah, okay, because I looked up JPress during. Mm-hmm. And what happened to him? You have no idea. Yeah, that I think maybe he did live. Okay, we'll talk later. Maybe we'll be able to trace him now. Is what? I'm sorry. Okay.
Well, Bloom remained in Tel Aviv for many years. The family is still there.
Okay, so maybe we can help you trace them. Okay, that was the first question. The second question about your paper. I was wondering because the problem with companies usually is the third generation, right? We're talking about companies that were much more than 3 generations ago. I was wondering how many of them exist today, and are there any of them that were Jewish-owned, or majority of the Jewish-owned that still exist? And if so, does their past is like erased or is it mentioned?
This project concerns only births. We do not have data for deaths. However, certain Jews that were in minority shareholders in non-Jewish companies, these companies, some of these companies still exist, the large ones. So we do have some continuity. The majority, I can't think of any majority Jewish company at the moment in Greece. I mean, it's like a race. Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I think on behalf of all of us, we should thank the whole presenters of this session. Thank you very much. It's quite late. It was a very interesting one, and it rose a lot of questions. And I guess we still discuss it later on. And I now invite Professor George Kazamias to say a few words, concluding words of the whole conference, please.
It will be literally a few words. We had a long 1.5 days, and it's late. We're all tired, and I don't need to take up an excessive amount of your time. We had a lot of very interesting papers. Displaced persons, camps in Cyprus, and about Jews in business, and the detention camps, and Salonika and education. All this is a very varied series of very varied themes. I was very positively surprised by the quality of most presentations. I will, on purpose, avoid mentioning names, but all of them were quite interesting and and filled in a gap, certainly in my mind. What I'm missing now is the wider angle. All conferences have got this sort of drawback in that we essentially take a relatively small angle and develop it. The question now is, how does this fit in a wider scheme? But that's a general question. It's not something that we can answer. It's something we might want to think about when getting our papers ready for publication. And this is the last thing I want to mention. We have every intention of publishing what the papers that we witnessed, we saw, and we'll have news about this in the following weeks, I hope, or months certainly. Anyway, this is not the last of the last of this conference. Our work still continues with your help and with our students' contributions as well. I think that's about all I wanted to say. Yossi, is there anything you want to add?
No.
Okay. Sorry? All right. We also need now have the dinner hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cyprus, and you will need some sort of ID to get in the. Oh, and the other. Before we go, we're going to have a collective picture of everybody here. So could I please ask you to step here under the sign and.